Welcome to all the viewers. My name is Lukain Sotsita, and we at Encounters are privileged and excited to be speaking to Michelle Harper and Yanu Akume, who are the creators behind Deliver Me, a film that follows the life of a Malawian biker in Cape Town during the country's unprecedented lockdown. A little more about the filmmakers themselves. Michelle Harper is a freelance curator, cultural programmer, and project manager for South Africa, from South Africa, specializing in arts in areas of film across the artistic spectrum. He is the Durban Film Arts Industry Program Creator and co-creator the industry program for the Durban Film Art 2019-2020. He worked on the DigiFest 4 European Film Festival in 2018, the National Arts Film Festival in 2018, the Durban International Film Festival, and Cape Town International Film Festival Market in 2018, just to name a few of the vast background he has. He is a co-founder of Engage, a Pan-African think tank aimed to create and foster continental networks with activities at Durban Film Art, Toronto International Film Festival, and the African International Film Festival as well. Yanu Akume is a filmmaker and composer based in Cape Town, South Africa. He has worked in a wide range of genres and forms, from narratives, fictions, to documentaries, theater, multimedia installations. Recent past projects that he's been part of include co-writing, directing, music composition, and cinematography for the short film Until the Silent Comes and A Jaguar's Daughter. He did the soundtrack composition for Everything Must Fall, which focuses on the Wit student movement of 2015-2017. Yanu has most recently completed the soundtrack of Rihad Desai's new film, How to Steal a Country, which focuses on state capture of South Africa and has already screened at the IDFA and numerous other film festivals. It's a pleasure to have you both here today, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, I'm gonna start with you. Yanu, I'm gonna start with you, and I think the first question I have has to be with one of the things that stood out the most about this film when I saw it, and that was the music and the soundtrack. So I wanted to ask, what informed the unconventional choice of music for this film documentary?
I'm glad we're having a conversation about music. Definitely something I feel more comfortable talking about. Yeah, at the early stages of research, when I was in the main, spending a lot of time on site with different Uber bike riders, doing really just site-specific research, which involved being present at the different sites that bike workers who are based in Cape Town work at. At the early stages of that process, I had a conversation with someone who spoke to me about an accident, a bike accident that they'd had. And they mentioned the feeling of floating for a second before a very hard and painful thud. And then everything from that went blank. And so originally the film that I'd hoped to set out to make would be one which was a story which concluded with there being an accident. Because it was something that many bike riders reflected on, being a big part of working in the industry, is the lack of support that's provided for you, whether you work for Uber or for just a restaurant, the lack of support that's provided for you in your hospital care. And so I thought that was a really important conversation to have in the film. So originally, we kind of set out in our filmmaking process to try and recreate that moment. And so the seed of the film, in many senses, was that point of collision, which to me came up really in a kind of a flash of an image, as a lot of the filmmaking process does for me in general, come up with one image in particular that then seeds out into a story. And that image of a man flying overhead in an accident was a lot of the film, actually. And in thinking about that image, I have a very long relationship with that composer's music. The composer is Maurice Ravel. and that relationship is very intimate, and it's very poetic, and his music is very poetic for me. And there was something about that first conversation I had with a bike rider recounting that feeling of floating, that music seemed to just evoke so powerfully. And then it just became a sticking point for the rest of the film. Not one that a lot of people liked, though. I have to say that choosing that music, a lot of the people who watched early cuts of the film were very thrown by having such a classical, and I feel like rightly pointed out, European sonic dimension to the film. But I also thought that juxtaposition in many ways helped you as an audience member to see the characters that you were going on a journey with, and in this context, the main character, Paul, in necessarily a different light than is maybe given often to films which get made in the context of Southern Africa, which juxtaposes sounds from the spaces that characters come from. And so whilst you may get necessarily a supposedly authentic idea of this person's life, there's something I felt something quite profound about juxtaposing Paul's life in the context of South Africa, which is a foreign space for him, with an equally foreign piece of music that had these poetic overtones. And it provided, I feel, for myself, and I hope for other people in the audience, a way into his humanity, which may have not necessarily been possible had I composed the music to be more space and context specific. So it was a really long answer, but it's a tough question.
It definitely touched on an aspect of the film that I got from the music, because the style of the film feels very disconnected, foreign, as the character is in this country, so I felt like it was poetic in that sense, and it's kind of what makes this film stand out from the rest, is how you stylize the music to almost convey how he feels, in order to put the audience in that uncomfortable situation that the character feels himself. So yeah, that was, I think, more people than not will be glad that you made that stylistic choice. Michelle, I want to ask you, how did you guys find Paul, and why was he the focal point of the story?
I can answer that,
Okay.
just because I was the one who was doing the side research.
Okay.
But I think there's something that I'd like to also involve Mitchell in that conversation specifically, which was our very early conversations that we had once we had found someone that we were interested in working with. We had very important conversations informed about the ethics of working with that person and what the shape of that relationship would be. Because I think for me very strongly, and I feel Mitchell agrees in this, and at least in the conversations that we've had, I felt that I wanted to involve Paul quite fundamentally in how we were making the work. I wanted to be totally transparent, and I wanted to also accept the reality that documentary filmmaking is a fictional making. As much as you're filming real people, you're making choices about when to film, how to film, what to edit, what not to edit, who to show in the frame, who not to show in the frame. It is a constructed process. And I feel like in this film, in this film, our filmmaking was very much conscious of that. Documentary filmmaking is a constructed process, and how do you use that as a creative tool necessarily, once you accept that it's not some kind of objective reality. But anyways, just to be very specific, the way we found, or the way that I met Paul, was just to go back to what I'd been saying earlier. I spent maybe 6 months researching with different Uber and restaurant bike riders in Cape Town, all over Cape Town, speaking to people over long periods of time, and spending a lot of time, and in lockdown as well, spending a lot of time out, probably when I was illegal even to actually be sitting outside, but I spent a lot of time with people trying to get a sense of people's worlds. And sometimes it was awkward, as research can be. And sometimes people opened up and sometimes people closed down. And other times I just stood in the rain for hours on end without having an opportunity to talk to anyone, because no one wanted to be bothered with some stranger asking them questions on top of the workload that they had. And I met Paul at an area called Cavendish, which is like a very fancy shopping mall here in the southern suburbs of Cape Town. And he, from like the second that I met him, I'd seen him driving around, but then when he finally introduced himself and I introduced myself, he totally got on board, because I was very transparent with everybody I spoke to from the first second of a conversation, why I was there, what my purpose was, that I was looking to make a film, and that I was looking to collaborate with one of the writers in the process of that filmmaking. And from the get-go, as I explained my process and what I was interested in doing, Paul understood it, and he immediately like, okay, let's do this. I'm on board. And I think that day after meeting him, I phoned Mitchell. I was like, I think I found the exact person that we need to work with. This man is amazing. He just has this incredible presence and confidence, and is obviously comfortable with the kind of direction that we want to go with this film. But yeah, I did want to give Mitchell more of a chance to speak to some of the conversations we had around the ethics of that relationship, because I think that's actually really important, really important conversation.
Yeah, if I may. So for us, it's quite important in terms of that we both come from a decolonial space in our approach to our filmmaking, and an inclusive and inherently open approach to filmmaking. And for one, as you've seen with the documentary, it's not your typical documentary. It almost feels like a surrealist journey. And I don't think, number one, I don't think we could have pulled that off and got the type of footage and told the story that we did without Paul. And I think as Janu said, it was the approach was to have him as inherently a part of the process of the filmmaking as possible. So we often consulted with him on what was being shot, what he was comfortable in, what wasn't he comfortable in. But also inherently that with documentary making, there's like as Janu says, it's fictionalized in its depiction as well, but it's also quite exploitative in the nature that we know documentary filmmaking to be. And for us, that we did our best to, number one, not only having an inclusive and wide-ranging crew, and our crew was very tiny, and we couldn't have made the film without the crew that we had, but also in terms of that the way that we worked around, we did the film while Paul was working. And we had to make sure that he received what we would call character support, which was for us recognizing that we were taking up from his very day-to-day time, and the very work that he does every day. And obviously to have a film crew following him around was a major disruption for us. So for us, there was a level of ethical filmmaking that needed to happen in not only the way that we actually made the film, but also with how we depicted Paul, but also his inclusion in the actual filmmaking process. I think that was one of the aims that we definitely went out to, because initially when we were making the film, we were discussing about how the approach would be, and we didn't want to go about conventional filmmaking ways, if that makes sense.
Like I understand what you're saying, and there's when you're going for something so out of the box, you need to make sure that I think the two most important things is that your film has to be grounded, and as well as in your relationships and collaborations with other people have to be there has to be clear communication, so everyone knows kind of like the vision we're going for. So between you two, how did you guys foster that relationship, and how were you guys able to kind of find the balance in order to make this film?
So firstly, I think when it came to the fostering of relationships, a lot had to do with the work that Janu had put in 6 months before in the research, and humanizing himself and humanizing the very subjects that characters rather, and participants that were in the film. I hate the term subject, but the actual participants in the film. And for us as well, you know, we made the film pretty much on a whim. We were actually developing another project, a fiction project at the time, and Yanu was just like, we need to make a film. We just need to get out and make a film. We like everybody else in the country were in lockdown, trying to figure things out, trying to figure out how to carry on with, get some sort of normality back. And Yanu just reached out to me, as we usually have these very inspiring phone calls that range between 5 minutes to an hour. And he just called me up and he said, I have this idea for a film. What do you think about it now? And I was like, yo, this is something I've thought about for most of my life. The many times that I have been to Cape Town, I've always noticed that both Uber drivers and Uber Eats food delivery drivers are foreign nationals. And I always wanted to explore that as like in some sort of like journalistic approach. But obviously we had spoken about making the film, and there was no really time to try and apply for development funding or any of that. So we then had to lean on some relationships that we had with the crew, which a lot of it came down to people that Yanu had worked with or had been in discussion about working with, and coming to some sort of agreements that, you know, we didn't have a major budget. We had to ensure that firstly that Paul was taken care of, but then realizing that, you know, the very crew that we were working with were also equal collaborators in what we were doing, and in a way sit as producers of the film, because, you know, without all of us sitting together, we came together to produce the film. I mean, I'm sitting here in Durban, and the rest of the crew and obviously the film is shot in Cape Town. So there was like it was an experimentation and collaboration that I'm very happy with the way that things turned out. And for us, that spirit of collaboration, we were lucky that our whole crew had that same idea about collaboration and approached the film with the same ethics that we approached it with, from the technical crew of lights and sound and the camera, to the post-production and, you know, and grading and coloring. We were very lucky to, and even the music that we got was given to us in a spirit of collaboration. So for us, we were very lucky, almost fortuitous that this happened. And the way that a lot has to do with the way that Yanu once like conveyed the film to the people that we worked with.
That's I think as a filmmaker, sometimes we try and make things perfect, and we want things to be perfect before we start. That sometimes starting is perfect. We forget that. So I commend how you guys were able to, during lockdown, able to work with each other and actually make this film, this maybe illegal film. But but we won't go there. Yanu, you mentioned something earlier about, you know, how this was a film but a documentary, and everything in frame is chosen. You know, and it got me thinking about something that I also saw in the film, and I was wondering about as well, is, you know, how much of the film was scripted as opposed to captured reality unfolding, you know, as it is, and how did you, more importantly, find the balance between the two to still keep the documentary elements of it?
I think right from the get-go, I had a conversation, or a series of conversations, with Mitchell, and then obviously with the main visual collaborator, Elijah Nduambe, who worked as our cinematographer, that I wanted the film to be both vividly real, and that speaks to documentary as much as it speaks to a style, because documentaries today, in terms of, also one thinks about Netflix and the terrain that is taken up with documentary filmmaking, documentaries are many things at the same time. One needs to only think about some films like this recent film about the actor from that brilliant Kubrick film. I've forgotten what his name is now. But
Anthony Modine.
Yeah, but I mean, the point being that I wanted to play with the form, But I was also fully aware that whilst I may have had ambitions to be playful and creative in a filmic sense, the person that I was working with was a real human being who was going through real shit and was in many senses struggling with the context of being in Cape Town, with the context of being away from their family. And actually on the kind of hierarchy of problems, COVID was actually quite low for this particular person. And so as much as I had kind of allusions to some kind of stylistic journey, I was also very conscious that we were working with someone who had their own expectations of me, expectations of the process, and their own lived reality. And so the film had to be a very, very responsible balancing of those things, of a stylistic approach which would resonate with this person's lived experience. And so to put a percentage to it, I would say probably about 75% of the film was filmed live time, just following Paul in his day-to-day work. And then 25% of it was us asking Paul to collaborate in a kind of artistic engagement in which we gave each other the space to really see how we could create an added dimension to what he was experiencing that would hopefully in the film in a narrative sense, and also just on a kind of felt affective sense, amplify the world that he is involved in and that he navigates. And I feel like in the end, that will be up to people in the audience to decide whether we were effective at doing that. But I'm very proud of that balance. And I feel like it arrived at the place that I feel comfortable with, which is also congruent with the ethics that we went into the process with. Yeah.
And just quickly in closing, there was a part of the film that I saw that I was wondering how much of it was in the moment and how much of it was planned. And that was a part when he's speaking to his family in his room, and his daughter has the phone, and they're missing each other. And then there's almost like a glitched figure of his wife. Quickly, just two questions. Is that his real wife? How did you get that footage? And secondly, was that scene of including his wife in the bed something pre-thought or in the moment in order to amplify the emotion of loneliness?
Okay, I think this is a really great question to kind of end off, because it speaks to everything that we've been speaking about the ethics of filmmaking in this particular instance, or our ethics really, as well as stylistic approaches that navigate slightly away from, let's say, the real and just a camera recording what's happening around it necessarily. As well as like predetermined settings that we think about we'd like to capture, a kind of scripting, which goes on all the time now in documentary filmmaking. People, in many instances, for funding applications, have to submit documentary scripts, however ludicrous that may sound. And so just to touch on the question of ethics, I wanted to spend some time capturing the space where Paul lived. And so over 2 visits, I came to visit him in that space. And that space is located in a township called Imizamayetu. And he lives in a very, very, very small room, a very dark, small room that is kind of, it's not a comfortable place to be present in, and it's certainly not a comfortable place for him to live in. And very early on in our discussions about what he would feel comfortable with us filming, he made it very clear that he would not feel comfortable with us filming in that room. And so that immediately was a red flag to me to say, this is not a physical space in the real that we are going to explore in the film. And so you'll notice in the film, we never see his geographic necessarily, we don't expansively go into the geography of where he lives explicitly. But I still wanted to capture some of the intimacy that is located within him and his family when they are away from everyone else, when he's not in public waiting, when he's making a phone call that is necessarily within a space where he can be vulnerable. And so what we ended up doing was I had a very long conversation with him about what he would feel comfortable with doing. And we agreed that we would recreate his room space in a very simple and uncomplicated way, in a studio that we have here at my house, which also has a workshop space that we use for various kinds of art making. We would recreate a very simple version of his room. And we would document a series of 3 phone calls that he would have with his partner and his child. And so that's the one level of it. So in a sense, we have a stage setting where he's given every level to feel as comfortable as possible, even though it is kind of course, uncomfortable. We have a stage setting on the other level. We have a real conversation. He was calling his partner, as he does every evening, every day, at the end of every day, calling his partner and calling his child to find out how they were. So we documented that series of phone conversations. And as you see in the film, we didn't cut those conversations. We have just those conversations from some point to the other point without any editing. And so nothing in that conversation is necessarily staged. It's real. And I feel like that is a great kind of metaphor for a lot of this film, is that although sometimes we frame things in certain ways or created the conditions for things to happen in certain ways, nothing was like scripted in that sense. It was spontaneous. It was of the moment. When it comes to the presence of his wife in the film, that was, again, like the music, something which was a contested conversation. There were people who watched it who felt uncomfortable by the presence of her in that room. And there were other people who thought it was something that worked and could work quite well. And my feeling of it in general was that I didn't feel comfortable with the presence of his partner and his child being just invisibilized, and only we would have a relationship to them via their voice. And I felt like I needed some kind of visual motif, some kind of visual interruption that would allow us to have a different relation to them as embodied presences within his life, and not just as these kind of digital intermediaries. And it turns out that the way that we rendered it actually has a lot of resonances with how we now experience Zoom. You know, we don't just have voices anymore. We have visual representations of the person at the other side. And so, yeah, although I didn't think of it like that at first, that turned out to be very beneficial. And then, to be very frank, she was an actress. We didn't ask his wife, who would have been impossible anyways, because she was in Malawi at the time with their daughter. And so we asked an actress to come and stand in. And of course, the intimacies of that moment of Paul's relationship to that actress and how we set up that situation were also really important. And that involved an extensive conversation and an extensive understanding to be created between the two of them about what was okay and what wasn't okay in that space. And so the way it ends up in the film is that it is something very simple, and it's not something which is over-rehearsed. We didn't rehearse at all. It's something which is very of the moment, and something which was taking into consideration both the ethics that we had as filmmakers, our relationship to Paul, as well as what that may add. And I felt it added a lot to the overall journey of the film.
Yeah, and I think it adds, it speaks to almost the language of the film, because the film has, although it's very steeped in reality, has a very surrealist feel to it, which, if you think about it, it's the journey itself and the life that Paul himself is living is not normal. It's a surreal journey, and if you think about it, it kind of speaks to the tones of surrealism and isolation. And even though with the technology being able to still keep his wife in touch with him, there's still this massive distance between them, which is an overarching theme of the film. It's of isolation and distance. So for me, I thought it was, outside of the ethical approach of having it, I think it adds value and adds a lot to the actual storytelling of the film.
Thank you so much for that insight. It really gives viewers a new perspective on the film. And I think you guys very well, Dudley and Groundly, portrayed and conveyed the emotions of Paul in this documentary, and many more other foreign nationals who come to South Africa as well. I think it paints them in a humane light, and it allows us to be able to connect with them on a much more personal level. So thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. This is a discussion that I think we could have much broader, and I think this is a film that has the potential as well to really do well. So I want to, on behalf of Encounters, I'd like to thank you again for spending time to speak about this film and sharing your insights on how you did it. And we wish you all the best for the future. Lastly, how can the public follow your work, or where can they follow your work?
I'm going to leave Mitchell to take that one.
Okay, so with regards to the film, the film has an Instagram page called Deliver Me Film. So it's just at Deliver Me Film. You can follow the journey of the film as we try and go from festival to festival, and as we take it out into the markets. With regards to and each of the people who have collaborated on the film, their profiles are highlighted within the actual Instagram, so you're welcome to follow it. And then watch it. And just again, thank you to Encounters for having us. Thank you to the audience for watching the film, and thank you, Lukaniso, for this great Q&A session. And again, one last thank you to all our collaborators as well.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Can I just say one big thank you to you, Lukaniso, for a fantastic interview. Big thank you to Encounters, but also fundamentally big thank you to all of the people who collaborated with us on this film and gave their time and their creativity and their vulnerability and their respect to the process. My DOP, Elijah Mbambe, my sound design and sound recordist, Denise Onan, our color grader, Thomas Dreyer and his team, and of course the editor, Catherine Myberg. Everyone brought significant parts of themselves to the process, and it wouldn't obviously be what it is without each one of their contributions.
100%.
On that note, I personally also, on behalf of Encounters, would like to thank the festival sponsors for their support and the public for joining us. I ask the public to continue to engage with us on our social media platforms, which you can connect with through going to encounters.co.za. On behalf of Encounters, thank you all for taking part in this Q&A session, and thank you to the audience as well for watching.